Welcome to the Ansible interview session. I'm excited to be here. Let us get started with the Ansible interview. What is Ansible and how does it fit into DevOps? Ansible is an open source automation tool used for configuration management, application deployment, and orchestration, helping DevOps teams achieve consistent and repeatable infrastructure. What is a playbook in Ansible? A playbook is a YAML file that defines tasks, roles, and configurations to automate a process on target machines. What are Ansible modules? Modules are reusable units in Ansible that perform specific tasks like installing packages, managing files, or starting services. What is an inventory file in Ansible? An inventory file lists the hosts or groups of hosts where Ansible will execute tasks. How do you define variables in Ansible? Variables in Ansible can be defined in playbooks, inventory files, or separate variable files to make automation dynamic and reusable. What is idempotency in Ansible? Idempotency ensures that running a playbook multiple times results in the same system state without unintended side effects. What is the difference between a role and a playbook? A role is a reusable structure containing tasks, files, templates, and variables, whereas a playbook is a sequence of plays executed on hosts. How can Ansible be integrated with CI/CD pipelines? Ansible can automate deployments and configuration changes as part of CI/CD pipelines using tools like Jenkins, GitLab CI, or Azure DevOps. What is a task in Ansible? A task is a single action executed on a target host, such as installing a package or starting a service. How do you handle sensitive data in Ansible? Sensitive data can be handled using Ansible Vault to encrypt secrets and prevent them from being exposed in playbooks. What is dynamic inventory in Ansible? Dynamic inventory allows Ansible to fetch host details from external sources like cloud providers or CMDBs instead of static files. How do you use templates in Ansible? Templates are Ginger2 files used to dynamically generate configuration files based on variables during automation. What is a handler in Ansible? A handler is a task triggered only when notified by another task, typically used for restarting services after configuration changes. What is Ansible Galaxy? Ansible Galaxy is a repository of community roles and collections that can be reused in your playbooks to save time and effort. How do you debug an Ansible playbook? Debugging can be done using the debug module, verbose mode, and checking return codes of tasks to identify issues. What is a fact in Ansible? Facts are system information collected by Ansible about hosts, such as OS details, IP addresses, and hardware specs. What is the difference between ad hoc commands and playbooks? Ad hoc commands are one-time commands executed from the command line, while playbooks define structured, repeatable automation workflows. How do you perform rolling updates with Ansible? Rolling updates are performed using serial execution in playbooks, updating a subset of hosts at a time to ensure minimal downtime. What is Ansible Tower? Ansible Tower is a web-based interface for Ansible that provides role-based access, job scheduling, and centralized management of playbooks. How do you manage multiple environments in Ansible? Multiple environments can be managed using inventory files, group_vars, host_vars, and environment-specific playbooks. What is idempotent module in Ansible? An idempotent module ensures that applying the module multiple times results in the same state, without changing the system unnecessarily. What is the difference between static and dynamic inventory? Static inventory uses a fixed list of hosts, while dynamic inventory fetches hosts dynamically from external sources. What is a role dependency? A role dependency is when one role requires another role to be executed first, specified in the meta/main.yml file. What is Ansible collection? Collections are packaging formats that bundle modules, roles, plugins, and playbooks for easy distribution and reuse. How do you manage Ansible versions across teams? Using virtual environments, version control, and requirements.yml files to ensure consistent Ansible versions and dependencies. Which is idempotent configuration management? Idempotent configuration ensures that repeated automation tasks result in the same system state, avoiding unintended changes. How do you handle errors in Ansible tasks? Errors can be handled using ignore_errors, failed_when, or block, rescue, constructs to manage failures gracefully. Which is a delegate_to in Ansible? Delegate_to allows a task to run on a host other than the target host. Useful for centralizing operations. Which is a block in Ansible? A block groups multiple tasks together, allowing shared error handling, retries, or conditional execution. Which is check mode in Ansible? Check mode simulates playbook execution without making changes to the target systems. Useful for validation. Which is Ansible pull? Ansible pull is a mode where nodes pull configuration from a central repository. Suitable for distributed systems. How do you manage secrets in Ansible Vault? Secrets can be encrypted, decrypted, and accessed in playbooks using Vault passwords or Vault ID files. Which is a notify in Ansible? Notify triggers a handler when a task reports a change, commonly used to restart services after updates. How do you structure a large Ansible project? By organizing into roles, playbooks, group_vars, host_vars, and separate environment directories. Which is async in Ansible? Async allows tasks to run asynchronously with a specified timeout, enabling non-blocking execution. Which is a loop in Ansible? Loops allow repeating tasks for multiple items, often using with_items or loop constructs. Which is a when condition in Ansible? When conditions control task execution based on variables or facts, enabling conditional automation. How do you perform rolling restarts in Ansible? By using serial execution and handlers, ensuring minimal downtime while restarting services gradually. Which is a lookup plugin? Lookup plugins fetch data from external sources, files, or APIs to use in playbooks dynamically. Which is the difference between delegate_to and run_once? Delegate_to runs a task on a specific host, while run_once executes the task only once regardless of host count. Which is a template module? The template module renders Ginger2 templates and writes the result to a file on the target host. Which is a role default variable? Default variables in a role are defined in defaults/main.yml and can be overridden by higher precedence variables. Which is a handler vs task? Handlers are triggered only on change notifications, while tasks execute directly when reached in the playbook. Which is gather_facts? Gather_facts collects system information about hosts, such as OS type, IP addresses, and memory, for use in tasks. How do you use tags in Ansible? Tags allow selective execution of tasks or roles, enabling partial playbook runs for efficiency. Which is a notify handler chain? Handler chains allow multiple handlers to trigger sequentially based on changes in tasks. How do you test Ansible playbooks? Testing can be done using Ansible Playbook Check, Molecule Framework, or dry run in development environments. Which is Molecule in Ansible? Molecule is a framework for testing Ansible roles and playbooks using Docker, Vagrant, or cloud instances. Which is Ansible.cfg? Ansible.cfg is the configuration file where settings like inventory location, roles path, and connection options are defined. Which is a fact cache? Fact cache stores collected facts to avoid repeated collection on multiple playbook runs, improving performance. How do you handle loops with complex data? Using with_items, with_dict, with_list, or loop constructs along with Ginger2 templating for dynamic iteration. Which is Ansible pull vs Ansible push? Ansible pull has nodes pull configuration from a repo, while Ansible push executes playbooks from a control node to target hosts. Which is the difference between include and import? Include executes tasks dynamically at runtime, while import loads tasks statically before playbook execution. How do you schedule Ansible playbooks? Scheduling can be done using cron jobs, Jenkins pipelines, or Tower, AWX job templates. What is idempotent deployment? Idempotent deployment ensures repeated automation does not alter system state beyond desired. Configuration. What is the difference between hosts, all and hosts, localhost? Hosts, all targets all hosts in inventory, while hosts, localhost runs tasks only on the local machine. How do you perform conditional inclusion of tasks? By using import_tasks or include_tasks with when conditions to execute tasks selectively. What is the difference between block and include_tasks? Block groups tasks with shared error handling or conditions. Include_tasks dynamically includes external task files. How do you version control Ansible projects? Using Git or other VCS to manage playbooks, roles, and configuration files for collaborative development. What is a vault password file? A file containing the password to decrypt Ansible vault secrets during automated playbook execution. How do you use loops with nested dictionaries? By iterating over dicts with _dict or loop constructs and using Ginger2 templating to access nested keys. What is Ansible pull cron? Setting Ansible pull in cron ensures nodes periodically pull and apply configuration updates automatically. How do you implement CI/CD with Ansible? By integrating Ansible playbooks into pipelines that automate build, test, and deployment steps across environments. What is a rescue block? Rescue blocks handle errors for tasks within a block, allowing recovery actions in case of failure. What is a always block? Always blocks run tasks regardless of success or failure of the main block, typically for cleanup or notifications. What is the difference between static and dynamic roles? Static roles are predefined in the project. Dynamic roles are pulled from external sources like Ansible Galaxy. How do you manage configuration drift? By running playbooks regularly to enforce desired state and using monitoring to detect drift. What is the difference between Ansible and Ansible playbook commands? Ansible runs ad hoc commands, Ansible playbook executes structured playbooks. What is a YAML anchor and alias in Ansible? YAML anchors and aliases, asterisk, allow reuse of variables, tasks, or structures within playbooks for consistency. How do you handle multiple OS types? Using conditionals with Ansible_facts and targeting tasks or roles per OS type in playbooks. What is Ansible lint? Ansible lint is a tool to check playbooks for syntax, style, and best practices to maintain code quality. What is a collection namespace? A namespace organizes collections to prevent conflicts and distinguish community, certified, or custom roles and modules. What is serial execution? Serial execution limits the number of hosts processed at a time, useful for rolling updates or staged deployments. How do you ensure secure communication with hosts? By using SSH keys, proper permissions, vaults for secrets, and avoiding plain text credentials. What is the difference between local_action and delegate_to? Local_action runs tasks on the control node, delegate_to runs tasks on a different target host. What is the difference between template and copy modules? Template renders a file with variables using Ginger2. Copy simply transfers a static file to the target host. How do you handle dependencies between roles? By specifying dependencies in meta/main.yml to ensure required roles execute in order. What is the difference between notify and handler? Notify calls a handler when a task changes. Handlers contain tasks executed only on notification. What is Ansible pull use case? Useful in distributed environments where each node should pull and apply configuration autonomously. How do you implement blue-green deployments with Ansible? By provisioning two environments, blue and green, and switching traffic after deploying and testing the new version. What is an ephemeral environment? A temporary environment created for testing or feature deployment, often destroyed after use. What is a control node in Ansible? The control node is the machine where Ansible runs commands and manages target hosts. What is a managed node in Ansible? Managed nodes are the target machines where tasks and playbooks are executed. What is pull-based vs push-based automation? Pull-based nodes fetch configuration from a central repo. Ansible pull. Push-based automation runs from the control node to targets. How do you handle secrets in CI/CD pipelines with Ansible? By using Ansible Vault, environment variables, or secret management tools integrated into the pipeline. What is an Ansible collection vs role? A collection bundles multiple roles, modules, plugins, and playbooks. A role is a single reusable structure within a collection. How do you perform idempotent database migrations? By using tasks that check schema version or state before applying changes to avoid repeated modifications. What is the difference between include_role and import_role? Import_role loads roles statically before execution. Include_role loads roles dynamically at runtime. What is a dynamic variable in Ansible? A variable whose value is determined at runtime, often based on facts, calculations, or external data. How do you optimize large Ansible playbooks? By using roles, handlers, loops, includes, and minimizing repetitive tasks for efficiency and readability. What is Ansible connection plugins? Plugins that define how Ansible connects to target hosts, e.g., SSH, local, WinRM. How do you use with_file glob in loops? It loops over a list of files matching a pattern, often used for copying or templating multiple files. What is the difference between force and state equals present in copy module? Force overrides files unconditionally, state equals present copies only if file is missing or changed. What is Ansible callback plugin? Callback plugins allow custom actions when tasks are executed, such as logging, notifications, or reporting. How do you handle high availability with Ansible? By automating deployment across multiple nodes, load balancers, and failover configurations. What is the difference between YAML and package module? YAML is OS specific for Red Hat based systems. Package is generic and abstracts the underlying package manager. What is check mode with handlers? Handlers are not executed in check mode unless explicitly forced, preventing unintended changes during dry run. How do you implement canary deployment with Ansible? By deploying to a small subset of hosts first, monitoring results, and gradually rolling out to the rest. What is a frozen role? A frozen role is a versioned role that does not change, ensuring stable deployments across environments. How do you use facts in conditionals? Facts collected by Ansible can be referenced in when conditions to execute tasks based on system state. What is a callback for Slack notifications? A callback plugin can send playbook events, successes, or failures to Slack channels automatically. How do you handle OS differences in playbooks? By using conditionals, group_vars, and OS-specific tasks to ensure playbooks work across multiple platforms. What is Ansible AWX? AWX is the open-source upstream version of Ansible Tower providing web UI, API, and job management. What is idempotent state enforcement? Ensuring that each playbook run brings the system to the desired state without additional changes. How do you integrate Ansible with cloud providers? By using cloud-specific modules, dynamic inventory scripts, and API credentials to manage resources automatically. What is rolling configuration management? Updating configurations gradually across hosts to prevent downtime and reduce risk. How do you use notify with multiple handlers? A task can notify multiple handlers, each executed only once if the task reports a change. What is Ansible Runner? Ansible Runner is a tool in Python library to run Ansible jobs programmatically or from other systems. How do you debug variables in Ansible? Using the debug module to print variable values, or using verbosity, to inspect variable content during playbook execution. How do you manage role dependencies in complex projects? By defining dependencies in meta/main.yml and using structured role directories for modular automation. What is Ansible event-driven automation? Automation triggered by events or conditions, often integrated with monitoring tools for real-time responses. How do you ensure reproducible deployments with Ansible? By version controlling playbooks, roles, collections, and using idempotent tasks with consistent environments. What is the difference between Ansible playbook, check and diff? Check simulates execution without changes. Diff shows differences between current and desired states for changed files. How do you scale Ansible for thousands of hosts? By using dynamic inventory, serial execution, delegated tasks, and Ansible Tower or AWX for orchestration and monitoring. That concludes the interview. Thank you for listening. I appreciate the opportunity. Goodbye.